Uh, Hello, we can hear each other. Dear Professor Kalis, dear guests, and dear distinguished colleagues, and dear colleagues that are been watching this via Zoom. Today, we really have an honor of listening to something that we are kind of, with our resources, trying to understand. And this is actually the privilege. As you all know, we had 2 years ago, since there was a commemoration of 100 years from the March on Rome, and it was a good time, of course, connected with the actual using or abusing the F word, as they say in fascist studies. Everybody speaks about his enemy today as a fascist. So it was very good incentive to start to understand what is really going on with the fascist studies today. So I just have to remind us that we had the privilege of listening to Professor Roger Griffin, probably the most distinguished name concerning the fascist studies, somebody who opened the new chapter with the nature of fascism from 91. And we also organized quite a decent, I have to say, conference on understanding fascism today. And we publish a very good collection in which several of our colleagues, including colleague Rajko Petrović, Alex Filipović, Rajko wrote about Hispanic studies and situation in Hispanic countries. Alex wrote about history of Soviet and Russian dealing with fascism, their fascism studies, including one page, 2 pages about what they had translated from, let me say, mainstream. So it's also a very interesting article. When we continued with this, actually, due to Professor Griffin, we got in touch with Professor Aristovtle Kali's, who is today with us. Yesterday, we really had fantastic lecture in Matica Srpska, and we are continuing this kind of cooperation. He spoke yesterday about mostly Rome, Third Rome, and architecture in fascist Italy from 22 up to 43. And today we ask for some more, if I could say, theoretical, that was the idea. Lecture is going to call Revolutions of Banality, and speaking about some theoretical discussion about fascism, dictatorship in between 2 wars. So just briefly to present him, our guest is, if I could say, outbreed of Peloponnesia, in a way, from his family, but he was born and raised in Athens, where he studied history. After that, he went to Edinburgh in 93, if I'm right. He did his PhD there, and after that, he started to build, I could say, quite a successful career as a university professor. So just to mention first Edinburgh, then Leicester, Bristol, then Padova, many other states and cities in the world in which he also taught partly. I could say that he's really seen as one of the most interesting authors today on mid-war Europe. Of course, he specialized in Germany and Italy, and I will cut it short with only mentioning the most important stuff, and these are publications which really have very big influence today, especially in the fascist studies and the history of mid-wars. Just to mention, 2005, Nazi propaganda in Second World War. In 2009, book Genocide and Fascism. In 2014, the Third Rome from 2243, Making of Fascist Capital, out of which we listened yesterday some very interesting developments. Then in 2014, Rethinking Fascism and Dictatorship in Europe, which he co-edited together with Antonio Costa Pinto. And in 2015, Radical Right in Contemporary Europe, which he is also very interested in, let me say, following this tradition from mid-war up to what is happening today, how some of the, let me say, traditional ideas are being merged with some new ones. And as we all know, issue of radical right, especially in connection with recent elections, European parliamentary elections. But these days, for example, in Austria, we will have parliamentary elections in which it is expected that FPÖ will probably get the biggest number of votes. And I will finish with a very important collection of works dedicated to the work of Professor Roger Griffin that Professor Kalisz co-edited with Konstantin Yordaki, and it is called Beyond the Fascist Century. And I will stop here. Aristotle, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. There we go. Thank you very much. I certainly didn't want to infringe on your privileges. I just wanted, I tend to, whenever people introduce me, I tend to sort of say, I know this person, but probably I don't know this person very well. You know, it's kind of slightly awkward feeling for me. But thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you to all for coming, and more thank you to the Institute for inviting me here. It's a great thing, not to mention the fact that I have one more chance to visit Belgrade and other places like Novi Sad and stops in between, courtesy of Misha yesterday. I'm going to show this. I prepared this slideshow not because you need to read the bullet points, no, although sometimes it works like a summary, but because I have a few quotes that I thought it's easier if I show them over there. And sadly, I've made somebody else's life a little bit more difficult, but I hope we'll be able to do this one way or another. So, there's a bit of a provocation in this title, and that provocation is deliberate. Revolutions of banality bring together two words that don't necessarily go well instantly together, and I hope I will be explaining what I mean by this. But I suppose the closer perspective into what I want to talk today is the subtitle, okay? So I want to talk more about not fascism per se, but the appeal of fascism. And that appeal of fascism works in a number of different ways, works within a country. But what is even more interesting to me, and something that I've been working for some years now, is this idea of appeal outside. So I'm going to start with some questions that there are quite a lot of questions. I try to reduce them, but there are quite a lot of questions that I'm interested in. I'm not going to be able to answer them all, otherwise we'll be here till tomorrow. But at least I want to bring them into the focus of our discussion today. But let me very briefly start with a short story, as many of us do. Just before COVID, talking of big historical raptures, you know, there we go, before and after. I was at a conference in Padova on fascism, and after the conference, I had a drink with some colleagues, and one of them, who doesn't work on fascism studies, but in topics that connect with fascism studies, threw a question at me, and he said, do you really think that fascism was that special? And of course, the instant reaction of fascism scholars is to go back and say, of course, you know, we have the full list of reasons why fascism was unique, and so on and so forth. And I said, but why do you say that? And he said, because I think, he said, that something like fascism would have happened anyway. Now, that was a conversation over a drink, so we were not debating the subtleties of fascism. But, you know, I kind of put it aside for a while, for a while, but you know, it was an interesting point to make. I'm working on another book right now, which is quite different. It talks about iconic fascism, so it's not that different. Of course, it's on fascism, but it talks about iconicity and so on and so forth. And I deal with a lot of cases where fascists used violence, but not just to destroy, but to make a point. And they dress this violence up with symbols, with ritual, with spectacle. Okay? So let's see whether that works now. Down. Oh yeah, of course. There we go. So one of the episodes I deal with in the book is this one you can see over there. So this is the attack on the offices of the most important socialist newspaper in Italy, Avanti. Notice the date. I know that many of you are familiar with fascism, but I'm not going to assume, so forgive me if I should have assumed that. The date is 15th of March 1919, and we're talking about 3 weeks after the official foundation of the movement by Mussolini. And imagine the scene, a bunch of rogue activists meeting in Milan, not many, not relevant, fringe, a startup with very few chances of success, okay? 3 weeks later, there is this attack against a symbol of socialist power in Milan and in Italy. What's interesting about the story, so they went inside, they tried to burn the building, they caused some damage, they ransacked the building, they seized the publication for 2 days and so on. What's interesting about this is, I mean, how could the fascists, a small group, do something like this to Avanti? They did not act alone. They were acting together with all sorts of ultranationalist organizations, Arditi, other groups, futurists as well, irredentists, interventionists, ultranationalists, and so on and so forth. So the fascists were a tiny minority, tiny minority. But they worked very well with them, and they did similar things in Trieste, for example, when they attacked the Slovenian National Hall, Narodni Dom, and so on and so forth. So it's really interesting here. You have a new phenomenon that has absolutely no problem at the beginning of its life to work with other organizations, to make this kind of organic alliances with other ultranationalist forces. So that kind of made me think a little bit about what my colleague had said earlier. Not so much in the sense that fascism would have happened anyway, because that's a non-argument, but in the sense that maybe there is not something absolutely new and unique in what we call fascism. Okay, so why am I saying all this as an introduction? It's no surprise that those of us who work in fascism studies tend to approach fascism with a little bit of a tunnel vision. History begins a little bit in 1919 or 1918. Fascism appears as something new. Yes, it may have some antecedents, but they are the antecedents of fascism rather than the other way around. And something that we do quite often is, when our chronology doesn't work, I mentioned the example of, in a conversation we had earlier on, Orjuna in Yugoslavia, because technically Orjuna goes to the 1920-21 period. So we call it proto-fascist, as a kind of fascism before fascism, or fascist-like before fascist-like. So, you know, we're talking about quite interesting points. So we have problems with it. So that tunnel vision makes us focus too much on this fascism and lose sight of what we could call the broader picture, the bigger picture. that this fascism was part of a continuum of nationalist and ultranationalist thought, that they were forces that did not begin their political lives within the bunch of fascists who met in that square, but ended up being fascists. So the fascism recruited from all those other constituencies, fascist movements recruited from all those other constituencies, that they continue to work together with many of them. Italy is not the best example, but France, for example, is a very good example, when you had all sorts of paramilitary leagues, imperial leagues, nationalist formations, and fascist groups of all kinds of persuasions working together. So, with that in mind, trying to get a little bit out of my own tunnel vision, I kind of came up with a list of questions for today that, as I said, I'm not going to be able to answer fully, but I want us to maybe even keep in mind and then towards the end come together. So down. There we go. Oops. There. Okay. So here's the first one. So fascism begins its life in Italy. It's a fringe political solution, and for many, many years, even the Italian fascists say that this is an Italian solution to Italian problems. Okay, so how did something, and why did something like this become popular and gain traction in so many countries outside of Italy? Even if the people who brand it don't care that much about what's happened. So why something that happens far away and in 1920, 21 is a fringe phenomenon and not an easy phenomenon to like? They're violent, radical, rowdy activists. Why does it appeal to people and not only to small bunches of people here and there, but to some more mainstream figures, if you like? So that's one question we can use. Let's try again. Yeah. Oh, did you? No. Okay. All right. Thank you. It's a broader question. Okay. Why and how was fascism so widely in territory, but also so quickly spread? It's not just the wide. We're talking about within a few years. Okay. So this is quite important. Did I do this? Okay, good. How did a movement that began its life by openly rejecting doctrine in favor of action appeal to people? And how, the reason why I put this question here is because I want us to think, so how can we really build an argument when we say that it was the ideas of fascists that inspired the people in other countries, when actually the fascists themselves said very, very clearly that doctrine is not what motivates us? So this is an important point, so keep that in mind as well. Sorry. How and why this fascism appeal to existing, already mobilized forces? Because we tend to see fascism as something that starts in 1919 or whatever, we forget that the people who became fascists had long histories sometimes before them. They came from somewhere. They had already formed a worldview. They're not all 17 and 18-year-old or 19-year-old radicals who had fought and radicalized or brutalized, whatever you want to call it, in the trenches. There were other people who came with their own stories and were attracted to this particular fascism. And in the end, was the international history of this fascism, but also of other radical right-wing nationalist movements, more connected than we think, much more organically connected? And by connecting here, I don't mean where they close. I mean that they fed off each other. They supported each other. They intensified each other. And that this history of fascism is more contextual and contingent, more historical, rather than based on its ideological cores and its essences. So again, this is the same thing. This is all the questions together. As I said, I am not going to be able to go through them all, but keep in mind, thank you, that I am interested in this appeal across different constituencies, appeal across different contexts. That is the more surprising and the more interesting thing about fascism, and something that sometimes we take for granted, that it's absolutely to be expected that somebody in Czechoslovakia, a week after the March on Rome, decides that this is the moment to create a new movement that bears the name fascism, but is in Czechoslovakia. Or that somebody else in another country may not use the word fascism, but considers Mussolini as the future of European politics for what he did. This is the thing. So appeal is a very important aspect of what I'm trying to say. The appeal links to that concept of diffusion, which I'm going to problematize a bit. And then we have another problem, which we have been struggling with for a very long time. Let's say that fascism did appeal and fascism did get diffused. But the outcomes in each case were different. We're battling all the time that some movements are anti-Semitic while some are not. I always use the case of Yugoslavia as another interesting case study in that respect, because in some respects, in the case of interwar Yugoslavia, the enemy is not the absolute enemy, the main enemy is not necessarily the communists, but they're actually people who come from the history of the region. So for one group is the other, for the other group is another one, and so on and so forth. So the results tend to be very, very different. In some countries, religion features very, very prominently. In some others, it is not. And it goes on and on and on. So this diversity is also something that we may need to explain a little bit more. So here you'll have to press a little bit more as I'm going along. So if I'm interested in the diffusion side of it, in the appeal side of it, let me place this interest very briefly into the trajectory of fascism studies. And let's imagine we start. I've kind of, yeah. Does it not move? Yep, okay. The trajectory of fascism studies begin with this kind of story of essence. What is fascism? And a story of origin. Where did it come from? Intellectually, we have scholars like Sternel, for example, but also David Roberts, who did not just focus on fascism and what is fascism, but tried to see what happened before it, how did we get there, was there something there before that maybe anticipate fascism. So that's a very important part. This is the bit that generic fascism studies particularly focuses on. It's a study of essence, it's a study of ontology, and so on. Linked to this, there are the other two stories, you can put them together. A story of radicalization. How does fascism, not does fascism radicalize, but it has a radicalizing effect on other constituencies. And a story of success. Why is fascism more successful in some cases? How does it get successful in Italy and in Germany? How does it not get successful in France and in other countries, and so on and so forth? These are the standard stories that many of us have dealt with at different times in our careers, in our work, in our research. And there are important stories. Subsequently, there were some other stories that came into this development of fascism studies. And one of them is the one largely I'm talking about here. It's the story of diffusion. In the last 10 years, there has been a major development in transnational studies, for example, of fascism, that tries to break this fragmentation of fascism studies according to Yugoslav, Italian, German, Greek, French, and so on and so forth, and trying to think about connections, about circulations, and so on and so forth. Recently, I got interested in the mobilities paradigm, which is a sociological perspective, but it's really interesting because it problematizes what transnational studies are trying to do, because the transnational studies sometimes track the movement, but the mobility studies problematize that movement. Why is that movement happening? Why is this happening in this particular way? How do ideas travel with, but also without people? So when somebody goes to Rome to see Mussolini, we can see the movement, but what does it happen when that Czech lawyer that I mentioned earlier on decided a week after the march of Rome, having not met Mussolini, having not been to Italy, that it's a good idea for the idea to reach Czechoslovakia and to become an important thing. So the story of diffusion has become quite important in recent years. One of the most important, in my opinion, one of the most innovative scholars is a political scientist who works in the United States, Kurt Wayland, who has written a book about authoritarian diffusion. And he has problematized exactly that this kind of diffusion does not happen. There must be a reason for it. There must be a reason that somebody else thinks that what's happening in Italy is relevant to them. So it's a very interesting one. It's a very interesting perspective. The final story, and the one that I'm more interested in today, is what I call the story of association. And here we come quite close. Because in the volume that you mentioned about that the Institute published about Roger Griffin, unbeknownst to me because I read it afterwards, you try to approach fascism in terms of the idea of family resemblances. I think what I'm trying to say is partly connected to this, but I'm also trying to say something different that you may agree or disagree, that the real power of fascism, let's say, was its appeal, but its appeal does not produce action. Appeal needs something more to become a mobilizing force. And how do you become a mobilizing force? And I'm talking here about network formation and so on and so forth. You need to recruit people. You need to convince people that something else is a good basis for them to become involved and become active participants. And so you need to associate them, I'm using this word more generally, to use existing resources, because the power of the fascist movements and the successful fascist movements were actually the ones that were able to recruit more widely and organize themselves more widely and spread the power more widely. And what does this mean? It means to recruit people from existing constituencies, existing networks, into the particular framework of action put forward by those fascists. Those other people and those other movements are part of the family, of course. But in many cases, fascism went the extra mile. So going back to my example of Avanti, a lot of those people who worked with fascism in 1919 to attack Avanti were already in the fascist movement as fascist activists when the fascists attacked Avanti again and again in 1921 and in 1922. They were no longer allies. They were already recruited into the movement. So this is what I mean by the story of association. And part of my critique to fascism studies, and it's a critique that I direct towards myself as well, so I'm not saying the others are doing it and I'm not doing it, is that we have focused perhaps a little bit more on the three first stories, and we need to combine these three first stories with these extra two stories that I'm talking about here, in many respects. So, yeah, this is a long quote, and this is trying to highlight something that we know already, because this is a quote from 1980. It's one of the classic works on fascism by a political scientist again, Juan Linz. And he talks about one of the standard phrases that we use for fascism. Fascism was a latecomer. What does it mean to be a latecomer? And I'm quoting, I'm reading directly from Linz here. It is the latecomer character of fascism, latecomer in many ways, that is, in our view, accounts not only for the very different successes of movements with similar ideologies and for the very different social basis of support and everything. So the latecomer status of fascism arrives in an already, as he calls it, overcrowded political scene and tries to make its space. Okay? Linz continues, as mentioned, in our view, it is the ambivalent character of movement based on the rejection of existing political alternatives, combined with efforts to integrate these alternatives into new synthesis, itself in part explained by this late appearance, which accounts for the success of the fascist movements among quite different strata in dissimilar societies. So essentially, if you arrive late, you have to position yourself against what's already there. So you draw most of your strength against what you don't like, anti-socialist, anti-liberal, anti-conservative, in some cases anti-religious, and so on and so forth, anti-minority, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-Freemason, and so on and so forth. And that already allows you to have a say, because these are already familiar tropes to people. So you plug into an already existing space of activists who are sharing your opponents, your ideas of who the enemies are. But if you scroll a little bit down to the other bit that I have highlighted, Linz says, however, their ideal of national integration made it difficult to reject support from wherever it came and tended to make them catch all parties. Now, I disagree with this analysis, but I keep the first bit. Fascists came with something, glorification of nation, ideal of national regeneration, unity, and so on and so forth, as well as the strong hatred of the enemies that they had at the time. And then he says it is difficult to reject support to that. How could you? Who doesn't love the nation? Who doesn't want to defend the nation against their enemies? So if you accept that the enemy is an enemy, if you accept that the enemy is a threat, if you accept that socialism is the absolute evil, if you accept that the Jews are part of an international conspiracy, then the message of the fascists as a latecomer is actually already quite appealing. That doesn't mean that you're going to be recruited into it, but it means that although as a latecomer, fascism has a head start. It kind of plugs into familiar tropes that people already are familiar with. I have another longer quote with regard to this, but let me bring in the provocative word in the title beforehand. When I read this line from Linz, although he doesn't use the word, when he says, who could resist somebody who comes and says something as simple as we have to love our nation above everything else, I read banality. I read something that is quite banal. It's not new, it's not exciting, it's not fascinating, it's not viral in the sense of something that people haven't seen. It's something familiar and, yes, indeed banal. So here is the bit on banality. And I'm sorry, I don't have that many quotes, but here's a big one. And again, it comes from a historical piece, if you like, if you can follow it. Oh, have I got... yeah, it's... if you move it, yeah, that I'm using two definitions here of banality, but one of them is the obvious one. It comes from Alice Kaplan. She has written a very interesting book, some years now, about French fascism and literature. It says, for me, she uses the word banality a lot. She says, for me, banal is something that is, quote, open to the use of the entire community. So let us not think of banal as something that has no value. Let us think of banal something very familiar. So here comes the big one, the big quote, which is already there. This is Wilhelm Reich, okay? Now, you can read the whole thing, but you don't need to. But as you can see, because I've highlighted it, he does use the word directly. And essentially his point is that the fascists had a head start vis-a-vis the socialists at the time. Because the socialists came up with something radically new as a proposition to the working class, to the proletariat. The fascists, on the other hand, came up with very familiar tropes. And Wilhelm Reich makes this point, and he says, because at the end of the day, everybody likes something familiar and reassuring, something that we may want to fall back on at times of crisis and insecurity and anxiety and so on and so forth. And he finishes this by saying we must pay much more attention to these details of everyday life, meaning these details that made fascism so appealing, not only, according to the Marxist analysis, to the big interests, the big business, the big agrarians, and so on and so forth, not only to the middle classes and the bourgeoisie who felt threatened, but actually to large sections of the working class. Counterintuitively, but he says the fascists had a head start. They appeal to the familiar, to the already embedded, to the reassuring. And if you win the narrative of what the problem is, then you have a willing audience to convert, as it were, to recruit, is a better word in that respect. Now, somebody yesterday at Matica asked me what I think about George Mose. And I said that he's the alpha and the omega, allow me, this, of fascism studies in so many ways. Again, if you go back, you'll find something. He talked of fascism as a scavenger. There's two quotes here, but it doesn't matter. Just focus on the one on the left, because that's quite more interesting. Fascism was a scavenger which attempted to annex all that appealed to people in the 19th and 20th century: Romanticism, liberalism, socialism, as well as Darwinism and modern technology. Too little attention has been paid to this scavenging. It has been subsumed under the so-called eclecticism of fascism. For most, fascism basically raided all the cupboards, went around and found things that people wanted to hear at the time and put them and appropriated and so on and so forth. The reason why I'm putting it here is because even Mose, one of the titans of the definition of fascism as something unique and special, prefaces this by saying this originality is not in the essences of fascism, but in the synthesis. And Roger Griffin, with whom I had many interesting conversations in that respect, would no doubt agree with me in that respect. But if you take the three elements of his definition, populism, rebirth, ultranationalism, individually, and this is one of the main criticisms by others to the fascist minimum, individually, there's nothing new there. Ultranationalism, no new thing. Populism, God, and rebirth, which is one of the other arguments. But Roger's, and I would say my defense would be, it's the interface between the three that creates an alchemy, something that becomes new in the process, albeit with rather base materials, like in the tradition of the alchemy. So, in that respect, you can forward it. The enigma here is a double enigma. How does fascism appeal to existing constituencies who have already been formed, who are already politically active, who maybe already have their own networks much stronger than fascism in 1919, 1920, much in Italy, much stronger than fascism in other countries afterwards, and so on and so forth. So how did they plug themselves into this space, and they appealed to them, and they mobilized them into their cause, people who were already organized? And how do we explain the fact that out of this process, different groups in different countries, sometimes within the same country, come to different conclusions? So we have fascism in all those variants that we have so many problems to link in that respect. So, yeah. I'm back at diffusion. Diffusion, something that spreads, something that circulates. This kind of approach challenges the essentialist view of fascism. That fascism is a matter of ideological essences. I'm not saying this is what the new consensus, I'm not saying this is what the minimum, fascist minimum is. I'm just saying that this is sometimes a kind of tendency that we assume that fascism is something that we can get a deeper understanding of by purely focusing on its ideology and its discourse. So how do we go beyond this essence of fascism idea? We focus on diffusion, we focus on this kind of transfer. But of course, that's not the whole story. Diffusion may happen, but diffusion is a matter of reception as well. So what happens at the receiving end? And in my opinion, that's also a matter of that kind of association. So ideas travel, everything travels. In the 20th century, traveling ideas and information and knowledge is not a problem. We're not in the 15th century when for a piece of information to travel from Frankfurt to Mainz, you need 2 weeks. Okay, this can happen instantly, it can take a day, it can take 2 days, and so on and so forth. The question is why certain ideas attract the attention of people amidst a flood of ideas, amidst a whole excess of new information, and so on and so forth. And even when they attract the attention, how do we go that extra step? Something may be interesting, may attract your attention, but you may reject it. This is what happened with a number of political actors in the 20s and 30s. They were interested in fascism, but they rejected in whole or in part. But how do you go that extra step, which is to say, I'm interested, I engage with it, and I like it so much that I become an active recruit one way or another, whether by going out in the streets or by declaring a dictatorship and then putting forward a corporatist state. That is not so simple. That is not something we can take for granted because Mussolini was successful in Italy in 1922. And here's a quick quote, the previous one, that Diane Stone, who's somebody who's working in these diffusion studies, said that for the process of changes that happen as a result of transferring ideas requires more investigation. It is important to detail and conceptualize further how ideas and policies are not merely transferred over space, go from A to B, and that's it, that's the end of it, but rather their form and their effects are transformed through these journeys. We are not talking about a diffusion of essences. We're not talking about a thing that travels from A to B and arrives at B and people see it and take it. All that involves change, involves reception that changes, involves something that I call, but not I call, but in this context I call translation. So you need these two concepts, which again don't appear very often. Friction is a word that comes very, very strongly in mobility studies. And I will very briefly say a few things about it. Translation comes from a number of different studies. I use it mostly in the sense of the French critical tradition of the actor network theory. The translation is something that is everywhere. It exists all the time. It's the fundamental of communication. It's the fundamental of learning. It's the fundamental of action, and so on and so forth. So these two words, to me, are very important in this process of diffusion and help us understand this diffusion a little bit more. Friction. What does friction mean? You see a very quick quote by a fascinating study, anthropological study, an ethnographic study of engagement. Friction is active engagement. So again, going back to my metaphor about we're surrounded by a sea of information. More so now, but also at the beginning of the 20th century. People read, people hear, people communicate. Things travel fast. So the problem is not knowing what's happening. The problem is attracting attention for what's happening. Okay? So how do we go from that to something among this sea of information becomes interesting? The process of engagement. You engage with something, and when you engage with something, you have already started to translate that something, to make it your own. What does translation mean in this context? To make it relevant to you, to make it relevant to the context in which you are an actor. So if fascism is anti-Semitic in one country, the moment that another person from another context engages with it, already translates what they see into something that has relevance to the local context. And if Jews are considered a major enemy in their context, it's a no-brainer, of course. But if they're not, and there are many cases of fascist movements that did not have this particular element, then this gets shaded out of the picture as part of this active translation in so many ways. Friction is agency. It's the agency of the actor who is no longer at the receiving end, waiting for the fascist thing to arrive and to pick it up. And it's not unsuccessful or less fascist if the actor at the other end decides to take this apart and select it and change it and interpret it and put it in a completely different direction in that respect. One last thing that is important in this equation is what Hannah Arendt, for example, called the fertile ground. There's a little quote from Eichmann in Jerusalem. The reason why I'm bringing Hannah Arendt in this discussion, of course, is about the banality aspect of it, the very troubled use of banality in this context, but it is important that for all this to happen, for all this engagement to happen, for all this appeal to become really mobilizing, you need a fertile soil. And in many ways, the fertile soil in the context in which we're talking about, there have been many analyses of what made something like fascism appealing in other countries. Some people talked about cultures of defeat, the trauma of defeat. I prefer the idea of a culture of a loss, because even in successful countries in the First World War, like Romania, I would say like Yugoslavia. For many people, Yugoslavia was a major success, okay? So when you gain, you don't bemoan the fact that you lost territory, like in Hungary or in Germany. Italy, you gain, but at the same time, there is a sense of loss. Loss because you didn't gain everything you wanted. Loss because you still have those pesky socialists inside you who contest the authority of the state, so there is a loss of power. So it's this kind of culture of loss in the sense of, I deserve better. I need to have full power over this glorified nation. I need to have full sovereignty over my national space. I don't want Jews, I don't want minorities, I don't want socialists, I don't want all these people. I want full and total sovereignty over what I consider my national space. So I consider this much more of a fertile ground in that respect. And then there is this translation thing, and I think I'm going to skip this because we're getting quite late. So if you go to the next slide, and the next, that one. As I said, translation is a concept that is used very much in actor network theory studies and so on and so forth. It is a kind of, for them, it's a kind of translation that underpins every form of communication. So it's not something special, it's not something that distorts the message, it's something that happens all the time, okay? And there have been attempts to theorize this process of translation. One of them belongs to Calon. And the only reason why I put it there is because I just want you to look at the blue boxes. This is essentially what I was trying to say earlier on. So first of all, there is a problematization. Something we have here is not very good, and I'm looking around for other alternatives. Then there is the interest. Interest is something else. Interest that is not mine. Interest that comes from somewhere else, but I'm interested in. Then the enrollment, the engagement with it. Oh, this is more than just something I can reject. And finally, the mobilization. This is the associational bit. This is the bit where you think that this is worth fighting for, that this is worth pursuing, that this is worth doing something extra. Think of all these processes. So when we talk about diffusion, we don't talk simply about something that travels and simply appeals. There is a whole logic behind it that helps us understand what became one of the most successful stories of fascism, which is its appeal in that respect. And in that respect, my final point concerns probably the more difficult concept, but one that I think has got considerable mileage in what we are doing if we want to see fascism as part of this broader picture. Not only fascism as opposed to what doesn't fit, that we push away, but fascism as part of this whole continuum of radical, ultranationalists, some revolutionary, some more authoritarian, some more radical and revolutionary, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so this the concept of assemblages. I'm not going to go through the slideshow. I'm just going to very briefly explain because we need to wrap it up. Was developed by Deleuze and Guattari as a reaction to the idea of networks. Now, bear with me for a second. So when we talk about networks, sometimes we assume that its networks begin their life at the moment in which they are constructed. So we talk about networks of ultranationalists in Italy at the time when fascism appears. We talk about networks of fascist international. For Deleuze, the main problem was that these networks have histories before. The people who become part of those networks come from their own trajectories. They have their own stories behind it. So they wanted to suggest a different term. So they had suggested the term assemblage. The assemblage is an English translation of a French word that works much, much better, agencement, which technically means reordering, ordering of heterogeneous components into something that sees itself as linked. And that to me is very interesting because it accepts the heterogeneity of fascism, not only intellectually, but also socially. It accepts the fact that when fascism appealed, it appealed to different constituencies for different reasons, and these constituencies were mobilized across heterogeneous actors. And here I am using very briefly the example of authoritarian dictators who aligned themselves with fascist movements for periods of time, whether it is in Portugal, in Spain, the big success story, and so on and so forth, in Romania to an extent, and then maybe went along with them or rejected them in the process. So here's another element of the assemblage. The assemblage is fluid. At some point, it recruits people from particular constituencies, but that assemblage change all the time. That's often another very interesting reminder of the fact that even Italian fascism in 1920 and 21 was a universe apart from fascism in 1932, and was a universe apart from fascism in 1939. So how do we accept this? Okay, we can say Mussolini changed his mind. That's fine. But actually, if we look a little bit deeper, if we look about the groups of people that form up that, what I'm trying to say, the fascist assemblage, we gain a better understanding. So, for example, in 1936, after 1936, people like, I forget his name now, don't mind me, the anti-Semites, the people who supported biological racism, came more to the forefront. When in Yugoslavia, and I'm sorry for making a charlatan inroad into your own territory here, but when in Yugoslavia in 1929, most of the radical organizations of the 20s were banned, and then they had to come up later on. If we look at the history of their formation of something like SBOR, for example, we look at how they recruit people from existing organizations or from previous organizations. These people who are recruited into those organizations bring in their personal, their trajectory in that respect. So I just wanted to finish with this idea of assemblages as the end point of this associational story of fascism. And you can go to the very final example. No, keep going to the final slide, because I know I spoke for 50 minutes, so I don't want to speak anymore. So I started from the point that we have learned a lot about fascism essences, very helpful, but we need to shift our attention to the story of appeal, diffusion, and not just as a process of moving around and spreading to new audiences, but to understand how this process actually took place in different settings. This to me means that fascism becomes also a question of events, a question of history, a question of context, a question of contingency, rather than essence in that respect. I also wanted to make the case that if we are serious about taking the diffusion, the appeal and the diffusion of fascism seriously, and in my opinion we should, then we need something extra than simply doing what many transnational approaches do, which is to track movement and networks across borders, or what mobility studies do, which traces the movement of ideas from A to B. We need to understand what happens after people have engaged with an idea, after they have made it their own. We need to focus on this associational dynamic of fascism. For me, this is probably the biggest unsung success of fascism. The fact that it managed not only to gain power here and there, but to appeal, into inverted commas, to so many audiences, to mobilize so many audiences. Is not just the appeal, as I said, to mobilize, to recruit in one way or another across so many countries in such a short period of time. So we need more than diffusion, we need more than appeal, we need something that explains the engagement, what I call friction, the translations, these translations across the countries, and finally, the creation of those new, constantly changing, heterogeneous but very dynamic assemblages in different countries as well as across the countries that give us an insight into this very complex story of fascism that should be big enough to have not just Ustascia, because it ticks our list, not just Italian fascism, not just German National Socialism, but
Spectrum.
the whole spectrum, as you put it, of nuances, even if some of them do not fit our idea of what constitutes the essences of that phenomenon. Thank you.
We got one highly sophisticated methodological lecture and opening of the questions, actually, which really, I think, fantastically represents where the fascist studies have been going for the last 10 years, actually, because de facto it's moving from this search for the essence and ideology and something which defines everything toward real practical studies of what was really happening in those systems. And on the other hand, we mentioned this idea on spectrum, I mean, we should cross from this idea, well, Mussolini was fascist and nobody else was there, to understanding how this broadened spectrum functioned within contingent frameworks who were also defined by the local tradition, local positions, and so on and so on. So in that sense, thank you very much. I mean, this is very inspiring for going into practical. Yesterday, we had fantastic example about the analysis of the architecture, for example, and fantastic internal fights within the assemblage, within the different times of what is fascist dictatorship, which was fantastic. We mentioned also about these fights within the, I don't know, philosophy or literature. What is fascist literature? So you get a bunch of different people who are fighting for that, and of course there is a one arbiter saying at the end, well, this is, but this is not, and so on and so on. Anyway, I'm stopping here. I think this is very, very inspirative. I already see at least a couple of hands here. So please join us into debate. Nikola Tucakov, please.
Thank you. Thank you for a really, really interesting lecture. My name is Nikola Tucakov. I'm a researcher here at the Institute of European Studies. I keenly listened to especially this methodological elaboration of how fascism works in terms of banality and these translations. My question, of course, as I think is a perennial question of fascism studies, would be at what point can we even cease to speak about fascism due to this process of translation, of friction, and of appropriating different banalities? At what point do differences of context amount to such different banalities and to such different syntheses that we can no longer identify these different movements as part of this same, you understand, this same grouping of fascism? Can we salvage any synthetic element that we can point to and say we shall judge this fascism, but this is basically violent nationalism, this is basically of a different order? So that would be my principal question. And also a small remark. I think this approach really raises an interesting question about studying something else, about studying anti-fascism, and of that particular chimera, and of that particular assemblage of different ideas associated with opposing fascism. And I think it has grown into an sort of ideology grouping of its own, the way the anti-fascism is interpreted in different societies at different times, and I think still relevant today. Today it's a sort of more institutionalized and a more mobilizable, I think, ideology than maybe even fascism is, than probably fascism is.
I didn't even have time for a warm-up with an easier question. So this is a very, very hard set of questions. You're right. I'm starting with the first question. Like with everything else, let us remember why generic fascism, why people like Mosse and then Payne and Griffin tried to focus on the essences, is because fascism had become so trivial prior to them that it had no conceptual value in that respect. I suppose so I agree with you, but I would say with regard to this that I think the danger that we faced in our studies was that what we decide to call fascism was escalated so much as to being the absolute center around which everything orbited. And I'm not saying that everybody does that, but to an extent we all did. Those of us who were working, this is it. This is the main thing. This is the point of reference for everything else. And I think we need to de-escalate it. There is part of what I was planning to say, and then I crossed it off, is something I feel very strongly about, that the future of fascism studies should weaken a little bit this division between centers and peripheries, or archetypes and peripheral cases. That is true to a very large extent. Okay, there's no particular good reason to consider Italy is a little bit special, I would still say, by mere chronology more than anything else. But why shouldn't we call Romania quite paradigmatic in many ways in terms of movement formation? And why isn't Spain, the example of Spain, paradigmatic of another scenario for fascism that actually involves a very happy assemblage between authoritarians, royalists, fascists, and so on and so forth. So what I mean by de-escalation is we can still salvage the ideal type. I think talking of ideal types is very useful because in my eyes, it does not raise any expectation that what I'm reading about for the ideal time, I'm going to find out there in the historical field. I will not. And I am not going to go to the other extreme and say that absolutely everything is part of that network. So I agree with you in that respect, but we need to de-escalate fascism and put it in itself. So part of the problem with talking about fascism and assemblage is, so do I talk about a fascist assemblage? No, even that is correct. In Italy it is correct, because in the end it recruits, and in Germany it becomes correct in many ways. And in some respects you can say, again, Romania is a very good case study in that respect. But in other parts, you have assemblages in which fascism is a constituent part, but it's not the dominant part, it's not everything. So I am not arguing that we should stop talking about fascism, not least because we have a familiar framework, not least because of anti-fascism in that respect. Absolutely not. I think we need to shift a little bit our center of gravity. One of the things that Deleuze says about assemblages is that assemblages are decentered. By that, what he means, of course, is that they could have a center here one day, and then they could have a center there, and they could have a center here, and so on and so forth. So it's actually an interesting perspective. So, and one thing I would say for more, I use the word banality in a very, very positive sense. And by that I mean something that has value by virtue of its reassuredness. Okay? So it's not the banalities of everything in that respect. For anti-fascism, it's a very interesting story. I haven't thought very much about this. As you said, and I totally agree with you, anti-fascism must go much more of a purchase in that respect. So you have a brand, a name that attracts so many different components. I can see, I am not an expert, I don't consider myself an expert on anti-fascism. I know there are people who are have done very, very good. But why not? The Anti-Fascist Alliances, first of all, even from the 1920s, were the prompt was obviously the definition of the Communist International that gave coherence to fascism as an international phenomenon. And then, if you look about how Mussolini talks about anti-fascists, he doesn't mean the socialists only. He means a number of other people. So I would say, I'm not an anti-fascism expert, but by all means, I actually see the whole idea of the associational approach to anti-fascism, and how, as you said, it manifests itself differently in different contexts as a very good application of this kind of use, even more than fascism, of this particular model. Excellent questions. For the second one, I need a month to think for an answer, but thank you.
Actually, there is a pretty decent book from Paul Gottfried, which is called Anti-Fascist. He wrote quite a good introductory, I could say. I wonder if you know this. His Fascism.
You mentioned it in
from 2016. Yeah, actually, which I'm thinking about maybe translating as a big. It's very tiny, but it's really problematic in the sense like he of course mentions the most important thinkers, development, and it's problem orientated. You have chapter, is it ideology of left or right? Is it then wonderful part on international fascism and the moves of Italy and other and so on. So I'm thinking really maybe as translating that as a good first introductory work of, better and so short, and then give us something.
There are more historical works in that respect. I mean, there is a tradition that comes from if you like, labor history more in that respect, comes from, but I mean, thank you for this point, because it made me think about something that it hadn't crossed my mind in that respect, that if you look, so, you have an anti-fascist coalition, you have an anti-fascist alliance, you have an anti-fascist network. Okay, let's drill a little bit deeper here. Who are these people? They come from previous networks, they come from previous organizations, they come together. They have different approaches to what the best strategy is, to how much violence can be used or not. Whether the main fight takes place on the street or outside. And above all, quite like in the case of fascism, how changing that meaning is on the ground, the shifting meaning. Now, that shifting, the point I was trying to make is that let's call it, for the sake of argument, the essence of a movement, whether it is fascism in that respect of anti-fascism, of course changes over time. How do we problematize this? The actors within the movement are the translators, in my view. They constantly interact with the essences, and they affect all these changes in those essences, and sometimes those changes become more popular and more people come into the movement, or new forces are appealing into the movement, and so on and so forth. I think that this works perfectly in the case of anti-fascism, and also in a diachronical sense, probably much better in that respect. Yes, so thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Vukalović.
Thank you very much. Ja moram na srpskom, samo kažite da ja nisam ni naučnik, ništa. Kratko. na kom mestu bi se važnosti za privlačnost fašizma moglo staviti sklonost ka hitnom nasilju kao možda najsigurnijem rešenju problema? To je prvo pitanje.
Prvo, polako samo malo. So the first question is actually within the whole this spectrum of importance of the different aspects of fascism, where concerning the appeal could exactly be situated this appeal to the violence and to direct violence concerning the appeal to the people.
So the violence has a bit of a difficult proposition.
Of course, how important it is for the appeal of fascism.
Koliko izučavanje fašizma može da doprinese izučavanju ljudske prirode? To je drugo pitanje. Dobro, još jedno.
The second one should be how much the study of fascism could contribute to the general study of the human nature as such.
Okay.
I posljednje. Barem kod nas, neobična je praksa da se izbegava nacizam i sve proglašava fašizmom, ne bi li se nacizam kao pojam i sadržaj sklonili u stranu. Koji bi bio razlog za to?
Okay, so he gave example in contemporary public discourse. Generally, you hear a lot about fascism and not so much about Nazism. Why, he asked you, why do you think this is the practice? And it's not only in Serbia, I think in many
So
countries.
using the word to identify contemporary
Exactly,
phenomena.
and not using Nazi or whatever, putting only fascism. Okay.
Violence. It's a very interesting question. Thank you for this, because of course, in many respects, for groups of people, violence, the violent behavior of the fascists was appealing in itself. For others, it was a little bit of a problem. I mean, violence is a taboo, okay? When you attack, when you burn, when you kill, even in many ways, that's a bit of a more difficult proposition to sell. But obviously, there are different ways in which violence may appeal. And to me, a very important way that can make violence acceptable, urgent, and justifiable in the end is the enemy. The construction of the enemy. How do you construct whatever your enemy is in a way, to use Carl Schmitt's analysis on this, it becomes absolute. That life with this enemy is no longer possible. There's no accommodation. It's either them or you. How do you communicate that argument? And how fertile the soil is already for making that argument. So with regard to socialism, there were large constituencies of people who already believed that socialism is a threat. Comes 1917, then you have Hungary, then you have Germany, then you have problems in different countries, and so on. The absolute evil. So socialism becomes something, local socialism becomes an extension of something that's much bigger, much more existential in that respect. Ethnic minorities, and Jews, obviously, another very, very important example, but ethnic minorities in that respect can construct each other in those purely existential terms. So, starting from this, you have an enemy who is absolute, who is totally evil, whom you can't tolerate in your space, who is invading and colonizing your space, who is threatening your existence. that already makes violence a less problematic opposition. So there were a lot of people, pardon me, who may not have been attracted to fascism because of the violence, but because they agreed with the diagnosis, they were happy to go along with the violence, even if it was a problematic proposition. But there were groups of people, of course, for whom violence was a defining moment of political performance, of action. It was exciting, it was iconic, it was spectacular, and so on and so forth. But fascism appealed to all those constituencies, okay? So I would say that it's a very interesting question in that respect. General study of the human nature, partly because I quoted from Wilhelm Reich, I would say absolutely. From my point of view, he helped me understand, talking again about violence, not only with regard to fascism, with regard to everything, how you can convince large groups of people that it is not only okay, but that it is morally acceptable and urgent to go and attack a member of another group. So I use the example of banality here in terms of appealing to something that is already quite heavily anchored. Another use, incidentally, of banality that I wanted to just very, very briefly mention is Michael Billig's book on banal nationalism, which is one of the most interesting stories in that respect. That, you know, we tend to talk about nationalism as big ideas and nationalist thinkers and so on and so forth, but nationalism is everywhere, is embedded in our everyday life as something like this. So how much easier does this familiarity, does this fertile ground make it for someone to accept a really extreme message? It says a lot about the human nature in the past, in the present, and always, you know, in so many ways. Absolutely. With regard to the Nazi, I think there is a much more, it's an interesting one, because on the one hand, there is more stigma associated to Nazism, but I think Nazism is very much connected to a very particular phenomenon in that respect. The word fascism has in many ways subsumed Nazism. And I still think that in this kind of popular imagination, and I still think that in many ways we're still using fascism in the way that Dimitrov intended it in so many ways. This kind of sort of loose label that, yes, has its origins in the particular things that were happening in Italy, but after a while, Italy is not even important. It's part of something much bigger, something transnational and international in many ways. In my country, when it came to the emergence of the Golden Dawn in the last decade, both words were used. And the Nazi label was used mostly to indicate militarized violence and not aggression, you know, the language and everything. So they were, when we were referring to them as a Nazi organization, we were referring to their symbology, the uniforms, the symbol, which has an uncanny resemblance to the swastika, but also the extreme violence. But this is, again, a context, a very different context, and it doesn't mean anything in that respect. But thank you for your question.
Hello once again, Rajko Petrović, Institute of European Studies. As Misha previously said, I'm dealing with Hispanic studies here on European soil with Spain and Portugal. So I would like to hear your opinion on Spanish and Portuguese fascism, if we can call them in that way, because it's still a great dilemma in a political theory. Linz and Stepan, for example, claim that those were authoritarian regimes, not totalitarian. So I would like to hear more from you about your point of view about Salazarism and Frankism. Thank you.
So can I, sorry, I'm going to answer it. Thank you for your question. Can I ask you, so you consider, however, the national syndicalists fascists? You consider the Falange fascist?
Personally, I do not.
Okay, interesting. Why?
No, I do not.
You do not?
Yeah, it was something completely different.
Okay.
I mean, at first it had a very strong religious Christian background. So I think that it makes a big difference between fascism in Italy. Although José Antonio Primo de Rivera was pretty much inspired by what was Mussolini.
Even if he didn't want to say it. Okay, this is an interesting one. I respect you. I mean, I have my position. I have absolutely no problem to consider Salazar part of the history of fascism, of the family, as you would put it, a good member of the family as well, quite influential. I mean, Portugal was a gateway to South America, of course, for Brazil in that respect, in the same way that Spain could be in that respect. I'm asking this question provocatively. Don't worry. I'm not asking you for an answer. Why should we expect that the translation, I'm using my own term, of Italian fascism in Spain would not be Christian? Or in Greece, for that matter, or in Slovakia, for that matter, or in Poland, for that matter, and so on and so forth. So, Romania, of course, which it was, you know, in many ways. So, the reason why I asked this question was not to take issue with what you said. I mean, everybody, we're all entitled to opinions, and I have been accused in many ways by basically flattening the whole field and making everything into a continuum and so on and so forth. I'm doing this provocatively, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is the conventional way of looking at all these translations is to say, and something that we do as well, you know, there is some connection. I can see some connection. Sometimes it's style. Sometimes it's the name. Sometimes it's not the name. Sometimes it's the uniform. Sometimes it's violence. Sometimes something else, whatever. But then we get into the differences, and there we say that was lack of revolutionary power is a failure, or it has this extra element which makes it different to the original in that respect. I think if we allowed, and I'm not saying we should, but I think that if we allow this idea of translation as an active process that is part of the production of fascism, okay? It's not something that translates the thing that we call fascism, but it becomes part of the history that created the histories of fascism, okay? So Salazar's version of whatever he had in mind, you can say he was influenced by Italy, he was influenced in terms of corporatism, but his Estado Novo is far more influential in South America than, in many ways, it is the Carta del Lavoro. So we kind of lose this kind of connection. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that when we get to the point, if we get to the point of talking about translations, similarity with the alleged original is not the benchmark for a successful translation. And I'm going to make a final provocative point. For me, a translation is more successful when it makes something resonant to the local context. So I wonder whether José Antonio Primo de Rivera didn't do very well in that respect, and somebody like Franco did much, much better, and somebody like Salazar did much, much better, in the sense that I acknowledge that they were inspired by something that was happening elsewhere, But as active translators, they said, I don't like this because I am a military man, I come from a conservative background, I don't want the violence, I want order, I want religion, of course, it's there. Therefore, my version, or I'm not going to even call it fascism, is going to have all these elements. I don't know whether I answered. So my question is, my answer to the original question is, I consider them not fascist because I don't play this game, but part of the history, of the whole spectrum, but also of the history that created what we call fascism. Happy to discuss later, though. It's very interesting. Your view is quite interesting as well. You consider Falange not fascist.
Yeah, but I'm not a political theorist, so I like to hear your opinion, Misha's, etc. It's
Okay.
very relevant for me.
Thank you very much. I'm Petar Milutinovic, a researcher at the Institute. Thank you very much for your commentary, your presentations, your view on this issue. I would just like to ask you for a comment on this. I entered a question in ChatGPT, why is fascism so appealing today? And it kind of gave me certain answers in sort of 5 dimensions. So I would just like to check out if ChatGPT is valid.
5 dimensions.
Yeah, exactly.
That's even more complex than what I did. So I'm happy.
So I would just like to check out with you if ChatGPT is valid. Fascism appeals to some due to a combination of social, economic, and psychological factors.
Okay.
One dimension is the economic uncertainty. In times of financial instability or inequality, people may feel anxious about the future. So fascism promises a strong centralized leadership and order, and offering an illusion of control and economic stability. The second dimension is the cultural and national identity dimension. Globalization and immigration can trigger fears about losing the national identity, and then fascism promotes some sort of return to traditional values, racial or ethnic purity, and nationalism, which can resonate with those feeling displaced or threatened by this kind of social changes that we're currently witnessing that are caused by globalization. The third dimension is the disillusionment with democracy, perceived inefficiency, corruption, ineffectiveness in democratic governance can lead people to seek alternatives, and then fascism comes with its some sort of answers regarding its authoritarian structures, perceiving itself as a decisive and a strong alternative to this. And the fourth dimension would be social media misinformation. The internet has amplified the reach of extremist ideologies, allowing it to spread through online communities and echo chambers that reinforce radical views. And the last but not least, the fifth dimension is fear and scapegoating. Fascism thrives on creative us versus them mentality, often scapegoating minorities or marginalized groups. This appeals to those looking for some to blame for current societal problems. So what do you make of this?
This is the first question of the sort I have, so thank you for this. It's great, by the way. I will probably ask my students to do the same thing as I'm teaching. So
a bit liberal, one-sided maybe, but fantastic, I think so. Huh?
look, I mean, what makes fascism appealing? Economic instability, cultural. Okay, so the national identity is what I would put under the banality argument that I was trying to make. Okay, that's the thing. Disillusionment with democracy. I noted down disillusionment with the mainstream, with the status quo, and that includes political actors, alternatives to democracy, and so on and so forth. Definitely a dimension. Misinformation, less of an issue in the historical frame we're talking about, but definitely one of the major issues in terms of, incidentally, misinformation. There's a whole body of literature that sees social media news and so on and so forth as part of this automatic translations that's happening now, right now. There's a fascinating body of literature in that respect. Scapegoating, again, I would put under my earlier point, but also the point I made with regard to you, the construction of the enemy, which the fascists did not construct in my case. It's almost already there. You know, there is already a ready narrative to plug into, to appropriate, and so on and so forth. Economic instability, of course. Insecurity, it doesn't need to be just economic. It could be economic, it could be cultural insecurity, especially if we talk about contemporary debates about migration, immigration, and so on and so forth. Absolutely. My question, stroke answer to you would be, I totally agree. ChatGPT did this better than I did because it did that in 30 seconds. My question is, starting from this, why does something like fascism, why is something like fascism seen by so many people as the solution to all these problems? There could be 100 solutions to these problems. Okay, you could work with your democratic establishment to change something else. You can be a Beppe Grillo and become a politician who's playing the game and so on and so forth. You can decide that you can scapegoat others, but maybe you can have stop doing this in one way or another. You can have economic instability, but maybe the answer is socialist revolution in that respect. You know, why not? That makes much more sense if you have a working class people. So I totally agree, but to me all these are the fertile soils. Okay, but to go from the fertile soil to therefore they became fascist, there are some steps in between that I want to problematize. Not least because fascism, we view it from the viewpoint of 1945, okay? In the 1920s, and I don't mention the early 1920s, fascism is an exception. It's something out there. Up until the late 1920s, what most people see as successful fascism, okay, they look at National Socialism, but we have to go into the 30s to see proper strength, is basically fascist Italy. You see small movements here and there, and that makes it, okay, that's interesting, but the real success story is there. Not least, what you see in the other countries is a violent, destructive movement that breaks the law, that causes damage, and so on and so forth. What I'm trying to say is that the fascist proposition is not the most intuitive to somebody who is a nationalist, who feels threatened by others, who is economically challenged, who is disillusioned with the mainstream. So I agree with the diagnosis, but we need to explain the appeal of something so extreme as fascism, we need something else.
Fascism is perceived as a sort of a technique, a methodology in gaining power, in conducting all of your ideological ambitions and political motivations and so on. So in sort of sense, I don't think that fascism is a sort of a pure ideology, such as communism, socialism are, but it's sort of a technique, a methodology in doing practical stuff in order to gain political power.
Okay, so we meet halfway. I would say that I don't consider fascism as an ideology in the same sense as socialism, but I'm not going to deny fascism ideological essence. But at the same time, what you're talking about, fascism as a technique, fascism as a policy blueprint, if you like, has already moved way away from the traditional definition of fascism as a phenomenon rooted in ideas and so on and so forth. So how do people look at something that's happening in Italy and say, I'm not going to adopt the whole thing because it doesn't fit me 100%, okay? I'm going to adopt certain ideas that they do really, really well. So I'm going to adopt corporatism. I'm going to adapt the organization of the youth. I'm going to adapt the way in which they broke down the power of the trade unions. I'm going to adapt the way in which they banned the political parties or whatever. This is a much more strategic and functional use with fascism, which in my opinion, some scholars of fascism would have a problem with. I don't. I agree with you, but to me that kind of falls, that kind of more liberal translation of fascism, not as a thing, as I keep saying, something that happens in Italy, therefore everybody has to do this in one way or another, nuances the picture. So I think we meet halfway, even if we appear to disagree with regards to this.
I have two questions,
Okay.
if you allow me. By the way, I have to comment a little bit why I mentioned a little bit of, let me say, liberal flavored definition of GPT that is keeping out. You're missing Nolte's dimension, that which might be, again, very interesting, that you see that left or radical left, transgender left is dominating everywhere. And then again, like you cannot do anything with democratic means. That's why you have to mobilize in a violent way. And it's the only way. By the way, it's not only why when I'm mentioning people, I always remind that for Mises in 27, in his liberalism wrote panegyrics to Mussolini saying, this is the only way we can stop Bolshevism. So it's not only Nolte, but von Mises, adored by libertarian circles, by the way. My two questions go like this, First, concerning internationalization of fascism, which you touched upon, it's very important in this translation and so on. Well, in the article that Roger wrote and gave to us in lecture, he has that fantastic point, actually, that the whole myth or construction of myth of march on Rome and gaining power by powerful, violent march made very bad services to the whole radical right in Europe, because they really thought that it is really necessary just to grab like 10,000 people to be violent and take the power. I said, no, it was not the true. But people in Belgium, in Hitler in 23, didn't know that actually. As we all know, Mussolini agreed coming to power with the elite, with the king. And after that, they just, made this performance. But they created that fantastic myth, which is really, that's why Roger's contribution was really fantastic. So my question was, of course, there are books and there are conferences on very, again, complex system of the moves of transnationalization or exporting fascism. So I would like you to give us a comment in that sense. Was it due to Italy, or sometimes in spite of Italy? Or, for example, French case was very interesting, that maybe exactly the Italian move made it less acceptable for the domestic, if I could say, population, or somehow. So if you can give us a little bit what
the Italian move, what do you mean by
Italian move for promotion of the fascism within, they had the office in Paris and so on.
Yeah.
But generally, if we could say that, if I could put it bluntly, was Italian move in this direction more productive or was it less
Did it do
productive?
damage in the end?
Did damage, or you have when you mentioned Oriona, and they were different. They were very strongly anti-Italian for very obvious reasons, defending Yugoslavism against revisionism and so on and so on. I mean, there's a bunch of problems here, like revisionist countries or not, and so on. But I would like to hear your comment on that. And of course, I'm coming back to contemporary moment going where the colleagues already started. A lot of debates for the last 10 years about, how we use fascism for what is really going on here. So concerning the Golden Dawn, I think, or early Jobbik, which was full anti-Semite with, their campaigns and so on. But generally, can we really speak about fascism or fascist movements or parties in contemporary Europe today? I mean, not to mention these small groups in Germany, some of them that come from time to time, but generally, what we have now is a radical right, which is again very broad spectrum. That, I mean, if you take AfD only, you will find from libertarians up to Hecke, very, very complex things. But can we use really F word for what is happening there, or are we seeing that? Are we seeing the tendencies? Because what I see was the different direction in which you have like Meloni and Swedish Democrats, for example, mainstreaming themselves and turning
in some cases,
and so.
Thank you for this. I mean, I think, first of all, let's talk about this Italian promotion of fascism. It was quite a timid affair for much of the 1920s. They targeted particular areas, but not in the, and we know that because there were discussions within the regimes, not in the sense of selling fascism abroad, but in terms of gaining traction and exercising influence in particular revisionist countries. Towards the end of the decade, of course, that changes, and then in the 1930s, we have these initiatives for international and so on, which don't go down very well, obviously. And viewed from that perspective, I would say, of course, it did more damage. There was much more of an aggressive marketing of fascism in the late 20s and early 30s by the Italian regime in a way that National Socialists did not do, although they did have particular Auslandsorganisation here and there, but not the branding, not the cultural capital, if you like, of the international ones. But I would say that at the same time, the Italians tried to promote something. So, for example, they promoted less fascism as a brand and more innovations. So corporatism became the major export product of fascism as a future of everything. Corporatism as a political, as an economic, but also as a political movement, as a political model of organization, alternative to liberal democracy and, of course, socialism, became the major thing. So in the late 1920s, there is an industry of built over the corporatist product as an Italian, as a fascist innovation, and almost like a proxy. I don't want to use a very, very fancy and difficult Greek word here. Proxy is good for fascism itself. Then, of course, in the early 1930s, it becomes this kind of idea of the Roman civilization, which to me is inexplicable. How would ever this be successful? But it appealed to some people, especially to Latin language countries to an extent. But when the fascists went to Montreux at the fascist conference in the early 1930s, they took offense. They said, we're not, we like you, but we don't like Romanità. And then somebody said, we like you, but we also don't like the Jews. You don't seem to be talking very much about the Jews. And it was particular people who diverged from this idea. So I would say the active promotion, it wasn't so active, but it became active later on, and at that point it didn't become productive, because then you had all the other local leaders saying, we like Mussolini, but we're not fascist. We have no connections with them. We get no money from them, and so on and so forth. So they had to position themselves with regard to this. But they also did something very, very clever, which was that they sold innovations. They marketed innovations. And these innovations were much easier to put forward. So corporatism in 1927, the Italians sponsored as a product, but in many ways, what the fascist regime had in mind, that corporatism will become the sum of the fascist regime. That was the original idea. That was Botai's idea. This structure is going to absorb everything in Italy by also throwing away the conservatives, the old-style conservatives, and so on and so forth, and it became the main thing. It didn't work out that way, but I think that even by branding corporatism, they were indirectly selling fascism, and that didn't harm them. Corporatism proved quite, incredibly successful long after it had failed in Italy. In Greece, the not so fascist, I put that into inverted commas, dictator Metaxas, who died in January 1941, unexpectedly, the weeks before his death, had worked on a corporatist constitution of Greece. It was his own version of corporatism, so I was trying to see Salazar somewhere there, or even the Carta del Lavoro. It was all over the place, but he was talking about a corporatist constitution. So in many ways, it was quite successful. With regard to the use of the F word today, I don't know how to answer this question. I would say that if we use it in a rhetorical sense, because certain words have already accumulated political capital, emotional capital, particularly in the context of the anti-fascist struggle, for example, who am I to say that we shouldn't use that word? In terms of strict analysis, I don't like using that word. I don't like using that word because it raises a claim to similitude that I cannot support empirically. And allow me to go back to my point about assemblages. The people who had supported fascism in the 1940s, forget about the people, the mindset that recruited people to fascism in the 1940s, and all these factors that ChatGPT told us earlier are diachronic. Okay, in that respect, if you like, the diagnosis that in the 1920s and 30s gave us fascism is still there. Do I see elements of fascism in what that you will allow me to call the assemblages of the radical right today? Absolutely. And I don't just mean the neo-fascists and the neo-Nazis, because I wouldn't use that term for the AfD, but in that respect. So do I see something? Do I see a link that is diachronic, not with the uniforms and the paramilitaries of the 1940s, but some of the processes and the mindset that actually convinced them to be recruited? So in terms of scholarly analysis, I'm not a big fan of using that word, because I am trying to make a similar point with regard to the interwar Europe. Not that we should stop using fascism, but we should see it as part of something bigger. I think it's flattening a picture of complexity to slap a term like this in the contemporary. But I can see the emotional appeal of it. And in that respect, I think it's quite important.
Thank you. And I think it's about the time that we should, that's right. Since we are here for 2 hours exactly, I think it's about time to say thanks to Aristotle. And I say it was really great pleasure listening to you and exploiting to you in these 2 days. We really learned quite a lot. And on the other hand, I'm glad that you might see that here are especially young people, and yesterday and today there were a couple of students with us in Novi Sad who even went to Nuremberg to see and to study. So I think that your idea about really making some, at least, I don't know, regional conference, at least we could start. By the way, Rasko couldn't come because he's ill. He sent you regards today. But I think that we have some good capacities here, maybe with the colleagues in the region, that we could maybe really start, maybe not so ambitiously like some big center, but at least from time to time to get some conference to bring 10 people or whatsoever. What do you think?
I'm going to say that this goes back to a discussion that I had with Misha, because we have, some of you will know that we have an organization called COMFAS, which is the umbrella organization. But for me, comparative fascism studies. And our goal has been, so you see, we are victims of the name. So how far can we stretch fascism? You know, it started as a kind of generic fascism thing, and now we're moving further and further away. We are moving into the contemporary, we're moving into outside of Europe, we're moving into authoritarian as opposed to totalitarian, and so on and so forth. But as we were doing this, I became aware of the fact that there is a NORFAS, and I don't know whether anybody knows that, is the Nordic Fascism Studies. And that is a proper regional network. Norway, Sweden, Finland. I don't think they're Danish colleagues, but why not, you know? There's always a little bit of fascism. There's always a little bit there. I come from the periphery of Europe. We are in the periphery of Europe. And I feel angry about this, not only because there's no such thing in the context of fascism studies, but because my nationality points me towards an interesting case study. Your research, those of you who work in Yugoslavia, are researching one of the most fascinating studies, not of fascism per se only, but of the assemblages of the right and all sorts of possible combinations that you could probably have. What an absolutely wonderful resource that we have here. So this is what the discussion was, you know, would it not be nice, quite like our Nordic colleagues did, who are always much more entrepreneurial than we are in the south of Europe, would it not be something like this? So that was a part of this. After today's discussion, first of all, I would like to stay in touch with many of you. And yes, if there was something, and we don't talk about a center with beautiful headquarters, no, but we're talking about something that can organize a few things, maybe an online meeting, maybe something like this, and also bring us into contact. There are colleagues in Bulgaria who are doing very, very good work. There are colleagues in Slovenia. I had the chance 2 years ago to go, I can't remember the name of the institute, but it was in Ljubljana. Excellent work. You know, we are working in silos, and this is a pity. And we are not going to, no COMFAS or any COMFAS is going to, and I don't mean only about fascism studies here, I mean about studies of the authoritarian, non-democratic, anti-liberal right in the past, but also in the present. No organization is going to bring us out of our isolation. We need to be a little bit more proactive. So the excellent quality, you know, most of the questions that I had today put me on the back foot. Big style. So thank you so much. You really engaged with the essence of what I'm saying, and that attests to the very high quality, to the extremely high quality of the research you're doing here. Not that it is a surprise, knowing the people who have run the institute for a while, but no, thank you so much. And as I said, I did put my email address at the very beginning in the first slide, but these days I mean, how difficult it is to find someone. It's impossible. But yes, it would be really nice, because we don't deserve the peripheral. And I don't mean in a geographic sense of the word here, but actually we can contribute insights through our case studies to the understanding of the bigger picture.
Parochial if we are.
We're not. We shouldn't be, and none of them should be. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.